said hi. Hi. Yay. Very cool. I've had a great time here today. I'm so excited for you learning Rails. So before we get into it, like we're talking about, if you'll go to railsconftutorials.com, there's a setup section, and where we clone a repo that we're going to do in the workshop, and then it runs bundle. And so based on the Wi-Fi today, it may take 40 minutes to actually install everything. So if you'll start that now, while I give my little preamble here, it may be ready for you 40 minutes later. What we're going to do is, like Jeff said, I'm going to babble on here about Ruby for 40 minutes or so, take a break, and then we'll do a workshop in which we're going to create a little beeper application that's going to send texts and emails when errors are reported, all through the magic of Ruby. It uses the Twilio API, so if you want to set that up too, that may also help things along a little later. All right, so back to Rails is just Ruby. When I first saw Rails, I was like, whoa, right? I mean, I was literally just floundered at how cool it was. I'd been doing software development for a while in the .NET space, and then like some Perl before that. And so to see Rails was just, whoa. And it just seemed crazy how magical it was, how much stuff was just built in to make the developer happy, right? And the more you learn about how all of this stuff works together, the more you realize that Rails is a great collection of patterns and APIs, and it got its whole ecosystem from the Ruby ecosystem that's set up for maximum developer happiness, right? Like the entire Rails ecosystem is basically one big hippie communes that we're all sitting and making sure that we're happy. That's so empowering. That's so cool. So what we're going to do today is look at a couple of different ways that the Ruby part of Rails helps make Rails Rails. There's some stuff that just seems magical about Rails, and I keep using this word magical, and it's sort of this theme as I try and teach the Ruby part of Rails. But there's stuff that Rails can do where it's so easy for you to provide great value to your business and to your awesome websites that you're creating just so easily. So you can just easily log every page load that happens. Like you can just go into a controller and log every time that something happens. And not necessarily to a log file, but you could have a access log for HIPAA applications. And this would be trivial for you to do. In other frameworks, it's not so much. What about being able to, anytime a record is updated, anytime at all, you can send those updates to another service, right? So you can have this full-text search engine that's optimized for full-text pattern lexical searching, and you can just send in the changes anytime that something's made. This is pretty magical stuff, and I mean, I know that right now we're like, oh, ho hum, but the ability to do this is game-changing. Pretty cool effect, right? So the whole idea here is that it's not really magic, right? It's Ruby, but when you're first getting into it, I mean, it is a little bit magical, right? Especially when stuff just works, when you're just working with a well-crafted API that just listens to what you're doing, and you've got somebody that has been working on it for a couple of years, and they're like, oh, you just do this, and you're like, are you really? That happened to me all the time. So, Gandalf, do you think that he thinks about what he's doing as magic? I'm not sure he does, right? Like, he knows commands to tell, like, his stick or, whatever, and it just works, right? To him, he's just using an API. But I'm not actually sure that this is the best example, and I'm going to probably offend a bunch of you here, but I don't really know what he does, right? He just seems to walk around and get people in trouble. So maybe a better example is Darth Vader. So Darth Vader, he's got actual, like, magic, right? Like, he's listening to people's thoughts halfway around the galaxy, seeing the past and the future, you know, choking people with his mind powers and throwing things at Yoda. This seems like actual magic. But to him, I mean, all he's done is actually figure out the API of the midi-chlorians that are all throughout his body, right? So to him, like, it's not magic. He just knows the API. So maybe that's just what we need to do, is just figure out the API for some of this stuff. And I'm happy no one left for my disparaging of Gandalf the wizard. But you can talk to me afterwards if I hurt your feelings. So you guys are wizards, right? Like, when business people ask you to do stuff, a lot of times they come up and they're like, man, I have no idea how long this is going to take. It could be, several weeks. I mean, I don't even know. And then by the time that they're done explaining what you want, maybe you've already done the prototype because it's just implementing this plugin or gem or whatever. I mean, to them, that's just like mind-blowing. But you just know what to do. But the reason that all of this exists is so that we can actually create business value, right? So that we can actually, that's the whole reason that we get paid to do this thing, and the reason that we provide back in open source. And Rails helps us along doing this. So a couple different ways that Rails helps us along that we're going to cover here are blocks, before filters and controllers, callbacks in models, and inheritance. And we're going to look at inheritance specifically in a controller, but that really does help the power that you can have. But it all starts with the block. So the block. Some Rails, like a group of Rails people were asked, like, what is it about Rails that makes it so Railsy, right? Like, what is it? What's the one feature that really enables all of the rest? And, at first I was thinking like it would be like method missing, or some of the other dynamic natures. Maybe it's the Ruby, like it's Ruby's ability to have a config variable or not have to declare your variables first. But no, it wasn't. It was blocks. It was the ability to send information in and have, like, it gives you so much ability to change your program to do what you want to do. So we're going to spend some time diving into the block. So this is a block. And the actual part about what a block is between the do and the end, you've got a bunch of code. That code represents a block. It's like a closure, where it is just some code that I'm going to send in and do it other times. And this will work, right? Like if you open up IRB and run this, you'll get YOLO 10 times, which is awesome, right? Valuable code right here. You can tweet this. But it's like 10 dot times, and I saw this, and I was like, this exists? This is a method in an actual programming language? And so what's happening is you send in the puts YOLO, and that part gets sent into each item in the array. Another thing that you've probably seen is you've probably seen this. And you saw this, and it was just syntax, right? Like this is how you do everything. So it's loop over each of the users and output their email. This is standard Rails templating that you would use. So the idea here is that the block starts with the do and goes until the end. It takes in each user, and you're able to output it. Or maybe you've seen this, where you're creating a user, and you pass a block into the create method that sets the values for it. So this could be like any number of things that you're setting, or frankly anything else. but it's user create, and it receives a block, and that's what sets the value of the user that you're actually creating. Or this. So here we are looping over all of the users, and we're using the enumerable function map to create a new array of whatever gets returned. And we're saying, okay, map over them and get the total due and then sum it at the end. So Ruby is using blocks here. So this is an alternative syntax where instead of the do end, you've got the little squirrely braces, and the inside of that is the block. Functionally similar. So if you are all on one line, use this. Otherwise, use the do end. But you see, like, blocks are everywhere once you start to see it. You see it in config values. And all it is code that's going to be executed later, right? So the person that implemented map has no idea how you were going to use map. Or the 10.times has no idea how you're going to use it, right? So you're sending in code that it's going to use later on. Some details about the block. Every method in Ruby can receive a block. And you, as you're developing it, don't actually have to do anything to let somebody send a block in. But if you want to make use of the sent in block, you actually have to yield to it. And you see yield most in Rails apps, mostly in the view, right? You've got your application template, and it's going to yield to the particular template, right? So it's going to yield to the main view, right? And so that's what's going on there, is it's yielding to that. So here in regular programming, you would yield to the block that one of your people are sending you code. You can have parameters for blocks. And a little gotcha is that if you don't send in enough parameters, you're not going to get an error. It's just going to be nil. So it works like this. With my super fantastic drawing here, it takes, for each of the arguments, right, like here args is an array of key values, and as you do each, it takes it and it comes up and then drops it into the local values here, right? So these become parameters to your block. And so it drops in its key value, and then you're able to use them inside of that block. So whenever you see what's going on, just imagine it like coming from each of the array into your block. Couple advanced tips. Don't use return in your block unless you really mean it. Because what happens is if you imagine that you've got a method that yields to a block that passed in, if the block has a return, that return is going to jump out of your calling method. It's not going to return inside of the method. It's going to return out of the method. This is almost certainly not what you want. So instead, you have to think about how with Ruby, you don't have to write return, right? It has implicit returns on the end of each method. So just think about it like that. Think that the block, the last thing in the block is going to get returned by the block to if you're assigning it in your method. So just use Ruby's implicit return instead if you need the value inside the block to come into your method. Sometimes you have to be like, okay, execute this code, and then like it fails, and you're like, no, really execute this code, and then it fails. And so Richard Schneems, who's here and just got married, created a cool gem called RiverRetry, and so it adds a method. And so to fix them, so you can say like 10 times how many times you want it to retry, and then you pass a block to it. And if there's an exception inside of some network communication thingy here, if there's an exception there, it'll retry it up to 10 times. I think that this is cool. You may have tried this in others where you're like looping over it and checking the value or whatever. As long as an exception is thrown here, it'll keep doing it up to 10 times, and then the 10th time it'll raise an exception. This is sort of a stupid human trick thing that you can do with Ruby, but it's made possible by the block. All right. Section 2, before filters. So before filters happen in a controller, right? And if we set our vocabulary a little bit, so controllers are made up of actions. And in a controller, those just look like methods. But those actions are basically like interactions with the browser. So you're showing a user, or you're creating a user, or listing a user with index. And so you can have before filters that execute code before or after each of those interactions with the browser. So before filters or after filters. But in my mind, they're all before filters, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you always use before filters, and it's rare that you do an after filter. But if you did need to use an after filter, that's something where you could like check to see and log out every time a model was changed. And you could use an after filter to check if it was persisted and then log it all out every single time. Or log out every page load with how long it took to do the actual processing. So a before filter will actually halt execution, which gives it even more power. So if a before filter returns false or redirects, then the actual code won't get shown. So the idea here is that if I'm showing a user, or if I'm creating a user, I could check to make sure that, that my user has the rights to do these things. So, or it can help dry up your code by getting code and doing it beforehand for the new and the edit. But doing the authorization in a before filter makes a lot of sense to me. So this is what CanCan does a lot. And you know, so you can easily have a before filter that's checking to make sure you're logged in, and if not, redirect you to the login page. We'll do that in the workshop. Here's an example of that very thing. So we've got a before filter, and we're saying, hey, unless you're logged in, redirect to the login page. So you could have this on any action, and it'll make sure that you're logged in before doing anything, before even fetching the record, not necessarily showing the record. A lot of times, instead of the block syntax, we actually set the method name instead. So we still say a before filter, and we give it a method name, and then it's that same code, but it's just a method. But it's the same concept, right? This is probably more popular in terms of what you see in the wild. It's the same thing. Now, we set this in the application controller, so we could just set it in the application controller and then inherit it. So post controller that inherits from it doesn't have to worry about that. That before filter will still execute. So this is a way, and this is generally what we do, where you can secure your entire application from unauthorized access, right? So it'll make sure that every request that's made comes in and does this, and make sure that it is, and if not, redirect you to the login page. This is another thing that nowadays seems ho-hum, but the ability to do this is pretty cool. You don't have to actually check it every single time. You can also skip before filters. So let's say that you have a post controller that's behind a paywall or whatever, but if somebody gives a specific share token that you want to actually show, you could actually do this. You could say, okay, I want to skip the before filter of authenticate user if share token valid or something. But the ability to sort of have a public controller and then a private controller or a public controller and then an API controller and a private controller. And like have an inheritance tree all the way throughout is pretty cool. So that you can make sure that if you have an API controller and then all of your API controllers inherit from that, they're all authenticated in the same way. Whereas your private controller, maybe they're all authenticated with user login, whereas everything, the API controller was an API token that's sent in, or a header or something. Cool. So let's talk about callbacks. Last year, RailsConf was in Austin, Texas, and I gave a talk about how you should not use callbacks in your model applications. It was at Ignite Rails. It wasn't RailsConf. The idea is that it can get you into some trouble, but it's also very powerful. So here, let's just talk about the very powerful and not so much the get you in trouble part. But it's code that you can define to execute later. So there's several times in what's called the active record lifecycle that you can have a callback happen. So the most obvious is, say, like after a record is created, do something. Create another record. Or I really like the BeforeFilter, or before validation. So anytime before a record is saved, let me run this code. The ability to do this is pretty cool. So here are the sort of 4 that most people would ever use. So before validation, before save, and after destroy. So each of these you can sneak code into. And for the before save, you can actually, if you return false, it won't save it, right? But generally in before validation, you can have code that would help your validates be validated. So you can have code there that you're going to execute so that it makes your validations pass. Setting default values maybe if the user didn't set one. But that's a little hard to grasp. So I've got 2 examples here. One is sort of the Stack Overflow example. Code that's not crazy useful, but it's illustrative. So we've got a user, and what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, before validation, I want you to downcase the emails. And if you're wondering, like, why would you ever need to downcase emails? If you're using, like, Postgres, and you're doing searches on emails, and it's somebody actually types in, like, Wolgamott with a big W, then the email wouldn't match right away, because case insensitivity search, because you didn't turn that on or whatever. So the easiest way is just downcase all your emails. There's a Stack Overflow objection to this, saying like, well, what about the people that like to have their emails in upper and lowercase? And I'm like, I cannot tell if you are trolling. But this is an easy way just to downcase. So before validations are really good for formatting issues. They're really good for default values, and I wholeheartedly support them. There's another case where this happens in the wild, and it's Fulltext searching, right? So it's web solar, or maybe you run like a solar server. And so what you do here is anytime a method is added, I need to add it to the index. And anytime it's changed, I need to tell the index that it's changed. And anytime it's deleted, I need to tell it that it's deleted. Without callbacks, what you'd have to do is maybe re-index the whole index every day or whatever. But then it's almost always out of date. So with callbacks, you can do it right away, and you can make sure that it's done anytime that model is changed, right? Whether it's changed through an API, whether it's changed through one method that's updating that method through something, like it is a consistent life cycle that you can hook into and do. So here's the actual code for Sunspot, right, that sets this up, where it's, you call searchable, and then you pass it a block, and you say, okay, I want a full text search on title and body, and that's all you have to do as the implementer of this. And all of a sudden, anytime that it's updated or changed or deleted, it'll handle it for you. This is magic. And then to use it, you just do post.search, full text, where is the best pizza? And the idea here is that you're calling search and passing it a block, and then it handles the actual call out to the Solr server, makes the request, gets the records back, loads it from your local data, and everybody's happy. They make use of the after destroy callback here, right? So even though what we're doing is just all we say is searchable, it runs all of this code that hooks into the after destroy and calls remove from index. Again, a lot of blocks, right? Okay, so it's workshop time. Let me see what time. Before we start the workshop, does anybody have any questions on pretty much anything that we talked about? Yes?
What about passing data into closures? Well, basically you set a variable before the closure is outside the closure, and then it's actually used inside the closure later.
So the question is, what about passing data into the block? You said closure, but into the block. So generally the way that you would do that is you would yield with a specific value. So you can call yield with a value that would go into it. And that's how it works in a enumerator, in an array. So if you're, so outside of that context, you can, if you needed to do that, then you could, in your method signature, grab a hold of that block. So you could grab a hold of it by saying ampersand BLK, and then that's a block, and then you could pass values into that. Now, if you want to have like true closure-like behavior where it has access to the variables before and after your function, yeah. So I would not use a block in that circumstance. I would use a I would use a lambda, which is similar, but you don't yield to it. You would actually call it. So with the lambda, pass it. It has access to the variables outside and can monitor change those. A block, I don't think it does, but I will check during workshop, and I'll get back to that. But yeah, the differences between blocks, lambdas, and closures, or blocks, lambdas, and procs can make your head spin. Yes?
Can you summarize the downsides to that callback talk?
So the idea with a callback, if you have a lot of side effects that happen every time that you save a model, then it becomes hard to reason about what all is happening every time. It complicates your testing in that, let's just use our example of every time I save a model, it goes out to post to Sunspot. When I actually test, I have to take that into account, and I either have to write a fake Sunspot server, which is what Sunspot Rails provides, or I have to think about stubbing that out so that it doesn't happen. And Sunspot does a good job of making this trivial, but code that you write, that just makes it that much harder. So if you save a model and it posts to some REST service, you then have to think about that any time that you actually save that, it's going to do that. And so then you have to either have ugly, like, don't do this if it's Rails environment.test, which I don't recommend, or you have to make sure that you're stubbing that method every single test. So in a completely unrelated test, that saves a record, you have to think about this callback. So it's sort of, it has wide-reaching tentacles.
Thank you.
Yes?
How critical is the text messaging description?
You don't have to do it. No, oh, no ferns uppers. Yeah, no, so I'm sorry, the question was, how critical is texting to the workshop? And it's not. It's sort of a cool feature, but you don't have to do it. All right. So, did anybody have any trouble either cloning or bundling the repo? Yes. Okay, I'll be right there. Okay, so if you're getting, when you clone the repo, if you're getting about SSH key, then that probably means that you're not, that GitHub doesn't know who you are. And go to the repo itself and click on the HTTP rather than the SSH. It'll give you that link, and you can git clone that one. But I'll be walking around, and I can walk you through that. So what we're going to do. Oh, yes? RailsCompTutorials.com. So what we're going to do, like our quick schedule update, is we're going to take a 5-minute break after this, and then I'll be walking around, and we can create the beeper program. So the beeper program is, think about it like a honey badger or air brake type application that receives errors. And the Git repos are set up to receive those errors, like that's taken care of. And we just need to add some notifications to that. So rather than just receiving an error, I actually want to send out an email, or I actually want to text the person on call. So if it's critical, we're going to send text messages, except to that guy. And if it's a warning, we're going to send an email. Thanks.